One day, a crowd gathered on the avenue of the royal castle and joyfully greeted the knights riding past on horseback. But one of those who also rode on horseback first was Duke Christopher in his white cloak with gold patterns. He finally returned to the castle, and only for this reason so many people gathered just to look at him. Duke Chris, who had been absent for years due to fighting, finally returned. He was so handsome that the girls went crazy. Everyone was talking about how he probably returned from the war to get married. It was a good chance for different ladies. This was true, but if any girl dared to marry this fierce man, she would not live long. He was a cruel and cold-blooded man, which is why everyone who knew about it did not want to marry him. And one of the ladies who was watching the man immediately ran to her father so that he would not make her a candidate for a bride. Although this time, the accompanying guy warned the Duke that this time he definitely had to resolve this issue. He didn't react to his words in any way as he moved further down the street, when suddenly they stopped abruptly, which was very strange. Apparently, something was happening up ahead that Christopher couldn't miss, and as he got closer, no one nearby could have expected it. In the center stood a pink-haired girl with a sword, which she pointed at some terrified guy. Apparently, he bullied the weak, which is why Cecilia could not ignore such rude behavior. He was unlucky enough to meet her today, especially under these circumstances. The boy lying on the ground apologized for what he did to the grandmother who was trying to pick apples from the road. He only asked her not to approach him, even though it was obvious that he was a nobleman, but why was he so afraid of her? Apparently they hadn't heard anything about this lady at all. She was born with the ability to absorb magic, and they even said that she brought bad luck. It is because of this that even nobles are afraid to approach her, but only when the old woman told about this did she realize that she had spoken with the Duke himself. This was a great stroke of luck for them, as they had been looking for just such a person for His Highness for quite some time. Now the guy had a new job. He had to study this girl with a sword in her hands. At the same time, Cecilia warned that if she saw this nobleman doing the same thing, she would never forgive him. The boy will remember this lesson forever, and once he is released, he could not help but take advantage of the situation to run away wherever his eyes lead. As soon as this performance was over, everyone around dispersed, because they did not want to get involved in this, even if they did not have any magic at all. Everyone avoided the girl, but it was even more unclear who had managed to spread such a rumor, because now everyone treated her like she had the plague. The crowd that had just recently surrounded her had gone about their business, but only Christopher remained and looked straight at the lady. From a distance, it was impossible to see who it was, so she thought that a new daredevil had appeared and was trying to get her attention. It was even possible that it was just a soldier who had returned from a mission, so it was not surprising that he did not know her. But now, the grandmother whom the lady helped tried to thank her, which was nice, but it wasn't worth it. Although the girl will still refuse the title of a good person, since it was not her goal to brighten her reputation. As soon as the conversation with the old woman was over, Cecilia warned the man that he should also run, and quickly. Otherwise, the girl would absorb his magic, which he would only be glad about. Christopher was not at all afraid of her because of this fact. This behavior was very strange, because he was the first one who did not try to run away from her after what he found out. The lady no longer wanted to be near him, which is why they separated, and later, closer to the night, there were important conversations in the residence of Duke Chris. According to the boy's investigation, Cecilia was the daughter of the Marquis of Daska and had studied fencing from a young age, and her skills were apparently at the highest level. Moreover, it was said that she could absorb other people's magic without any side effects, which was amazing. After all, this was a rather rare ability, and besides, she was considered a witch who brought misfortune to everyone around her. This information was very interesting, and, in Norton's opinion, she was also an ideal match for the Lord. Although the guy knew that at the moment his purpose of returning was to inform about the military situation. But they couldn't leave him in this state any longer, as the mana surges had already reached a level that was threatening both for him and the army around him. The man himself understood that he was getting worse and worse every day, so he asked her to find his sword, because tomorrow she would meet with Marquis Dask. That was great, but why did he need the sword at the meeting? Which was simple. He needed it to set up the wedding. It was surprising that he still decided to do such a thing, but then, the presence of a sword was even more inappropriate. Perhaps His Highness's illness had progressed so far that it had reached his brain, which would explain the presence of the sword. Much time passed from that moment, and the hour came when Christopher arrived at the residence of the Marquis of Daska. They were immediately met by a man who was worried that he was not tired after so many years on the battlefield and still came to him. This attitude was a great honor for him, but if he did not know what to say, it would be better to remain silent. Indeed, there was no point in continuing to talk about things that weren't worth talking about, and in the same spirit, they went inside. A few minutes later, they were sitting in the meeting room with a cup of tea and sweets. But the man didn't want to drag out the conversation for that long, so he suggested getting straight to the point he came today only because he wanted to marry his daughter. The Marquis never expected that a man would ever come to him who would want to take Cecilia as his wife. He couldn't believe his ears that someone actually said that and asked if it was a joke. But as Dusk could know, His Majesty the Duke had never had a sense of humor, so his words were not a joke. One of the maids observed their conversation and was amazed by the man's determination, which was even frightening. The girl needed to be informed about this urgently before she was confronted with such an important matter. And only after some time the maid was finally able to find the lady who had been training with the sword all this time. The girl was very out of breath while trying to find it, which is why she could not calmly tell about what happened. She needed to collect her thoughts before they could have a normal conversation. They had no need to rush. After waiting a little, Cecilia began to get curious about what had brought the maid here at such a time, and so quickly. But the whole thing was that some strange man came, who came to ask for my lady's hand. There was nothing new or surprising about this, although in recent days there have been especially many of them, which has become strange. These guests became too annoying, because how dare they say that they want to take her as a wife? It was worth looking at who came this time. And just as the girl wanted to go inside and look at this daredevil, he himself came to her. Now she shouldn't go anywhere because he came himself. His voice was too familiar. And as soon as the lady was able to look at the unexpected guest, she realized that it was the same guy she saw just yesterday. He didn't want to waste time and get it over with as quickly as possible. Apparently because of what happened in the city, he came all this way to challenge her to a duel. But he only told her father that he wanted to marry Cecilia, after which he ordered her consent to this. Although the man doubted that she would so easily accept an offer from some stranger, which was smart of him, the girl would even give him points for this, even though he only knows the way of the swordsman, where the defeated submits to the winner. He must have gone crazy, because it was supposed to be a marriage proposal, not a proposal for a duel. The Duke was the only one who made an offer using the principles of a swordsman, and did not even come to his senses or change his mind about this offer. But asking if she was afraid only played out the situation, because the girl had never been afraid of anything, having agreed to a duel. The man was already ready to attack, waiting for the lady to get ready, but by that moment the Marquis had managed to approach. He tried to stop his daughter from fighting, but she was not going to listen to him at all, thinking that he was worrying in vain. If Dusk wanted to talk, the lady would listen to him after she defeated this sleepyhead, but she simply didn't know the most important thing from the very beginning. The man she called Sleepyhead was the same invincible god of war, Duke Christopher, where nothing good would come from fighting him. That this man turned out to be Duke Chris, who was said to be insanely ferocious, was almost beyond belief. Knowing this, Cecilia finally realized that she would never win. If she had known about this earlier, she would not have agreed to this idea. But they had already crossed their blades, which made it quite difficult and disrespectful to refuse after such confident agreement. And yet it would have been worth giving up on this, because the girl was too naive to think that she could fight the Duke, much less win. Moreover, such an unfortunate woman as she is certainly not worthy of the Duke, therefore he should find someone else who will be worthy of his status. Just as she was about to bow out and leave, the tip of a sword was pointed at her throat, as if threatening. After all, from the very beginning, Christopher didn't come here to ask her opinion. And just to tell the lady about it just for this, he pretended that they were going to fight, to make a better impression. Now the girl had to understand that from the very beginning, without even asking her opinion, everything had been decided. According to rumors that turned out to be true, he is incredibly cruel and feuding with him can lead to terrible consequences. It was even possible that if she refused now, she might lose her head, although on such a beautiful day it was indecent to swing swords. That is why the lady suggested that they sit quietly and talk, which apparently already meant that she accepted the offer. All this time he did not lower his sword, as if threatening to cause harm, because they would only talk if she agreed. It would have been too risky to refuse, so I had to agree, but only under certain conditions. In that case, when the answer was positive, the man finally put away his sword, moving away. The Marquis tried to support his daughter after this, saying that if nothing worked out, he would talk to the Emperor and arrange a divorce. But there was nothing in his words that said he was against this marriage, which meant that her father approved of it. What was so, because if you think about it, finally a worthy young man appeared who was not afraid of her. And if you miss this chance, there will most likely not be another one, but even so, Dusk will always be on his daughter's side. Although Cecilia did not like this answer, the man hoped to the end that he was not mistaken in his decision to marry her to such a person. And since everything had been decided more or less calmly, everyone went into the building where further negotiations were to take place. The girl and the man went into a separate room with their servants, who had accompanied them all this time. By this time, the lady had managed to prepare a document with the conditions under which she agreed to give her hand and heart. But everything was not so simple, because she prepared everything in such a way that it only complicated life. The Duke would never accept such unfair conditions. One of the conditions was a ban on any physical touching without the consent of the other person. It was also impossible to restrict another person's freedom, social connections, or social outings, and to unconditionally ensure the safety of another person, where violence was strictly prohibited. For someone like him, these were terrible conditions, where he should have already changed his mind, but surprisingly, he quickly agreed to it. She couldn't believe that it was true, although the man had only one condition in return. It was very suspicious, because Christopher didn't even bother to tell her about his condition, fueling everything by saying that she would soon find out everything herself. After which this conversation was not prolonged for even a minute, and His Highness the Duke took his leave with his servant, leaving the girl to reflect on what had happened in the last few days that had led to this outcome. The lady did not want to believe that she had signed such a contract, asking Amelia if it was too late to regret it. But the girl had already signed the documents, so all that was left was to accept it as a given. Although all this time, no matter how much she reread everything, it seemed to her that she had been deceived somewhere. From that moment on, Cecilia had a lot to think about, and then the next sunny day arrived. In the Imperial Palace, everything was as usual. His Majesty was waiting for the man in his office. It wasn't worth keeping him waiting for long, considering how long they hadn't seen each other because of the battles. And as soon as Christopher entered the office, they immediately began to bombard him with questions about why he returned yesterday and only came to see them today. His Majesty did not understand what had made him stay for another day. The whole thing was that the man had urgent matters to attend to, that his plans changed, so he had to deal with them urgently. But what could be more urgent than meeting him, especially when he came back from the war? Of course, the meeting with His Highness was very important, but these plans concerned the man's personal life. This news made the Emperor very happy, because he apparently finally found someone he could like. The questions kept coming in more and more. And although Christopher did not tell him about it, this engagement was finally decided only now. Although remembering how he proposed to the girl, it was very difficult to call it a normal proposal. This news was remarkable, because it was His Majesty himself who was the first to learn of it. In that case, since he had finally learned to treat women well, he would let him go, since the ceremony itself was tomorrow. The fact that the ceremony was supposed to take place tomorrow was shocking information. After all, why did he take the Duke's wedding for granted? At least 2 or 3 months are needed to prepare for such an important event. But Christopher couldn't wait too long, especially since he was getting worse every day. The Emperor did not know the reason for such haste, because he thought that he was so deeply in love. And since everything was so serious, 1 month should have been enough, but even that period was too long. He couldn't wait more than a week because he felt that very soon his mana would get out of control. It was worth hurrying before things got really bad, and first he was going to register the marriage, and then hold the ceremony a week later. He was too much trouble, even if he was going to get married or not. But the question remained open for the Emperor. Whose daughter was this? She was the daughter of the Marquis d'Ask, Cecilia d'Ask. The girl about whom ominous rumors were constantly circulating. His Majesty now completely did not understand what was happening. In any case, he would resolve this issue, but for now the Duke was just an eyesore. With these words, he turned away. Since he had already resolved all the issues, all that remained was to wait. But before he could even take a step after leaving the office, he was immediately attacked with a sword, warning of an attack. It was a desperate attempt, because for Duke Chris, stopping such a sudden attack would have been easy. A few seconds later, the attacker was already lying on the floor in pain, realizing his defeat. And that attacker was the prince, a blonde man with blue eyes whose fencing skills had never improved. But even if the guy tried to become stronger, he still couldn't defeat a monster like him. And yet, if he hadn't slacked off on the training that the Duke himself had given him before leaving for the front, he wouldn't have been such a weakling. These words hurt the prince. He tried not to show that everything said was true, but the sword did not lie. Christopher could tell from just one glance that he was slacking off and wasn't even ashamed of it, relying only on the strength of his teacher. After all, it is with him that their army is invincible. Besides this, rumors have already reached him that the man did not come to them first. I went to the Dusk estate. It was a good moment to tell that the Duke was getting married. He should not forget about the wedding gift, and the prince will definitely arrange the most unforgettable holiday. With these words, Christopher went about his business, for finally all the affairs in the palace were resolved. At the same time, the news that Lord Chris wanted to get married reached even the common people. No one could believe that this was true, and even more so that his wife would be a girl from the House of Dusk. All the people who managed to notice the announcement on one of the streets gathered in front of it in order to see it for themselves. But for some nobles, it was wonderful not to be in her place with such a terrible man. Although they started spreading not the best rumors that now the witch and the devil are together, which means that fire fights fire. Everyone who could has already talked about their wedding, some were sad about it, and some said not the best words. But Cecilia herself was already very exhausted, because she had to buy some necklace herself for the wedding. In this matter, she was helped by a faithful servant who reminded her that the master and mistress had ordered her not to spare money. The girl was very much loved by her parents, although she didn't think so, because otherwise they would have broken off the engagement. Even though nothing could be done about it, everyone knew about this news, which meant it was necessary to prepare well for this day. At the same time, the maid was able to find suitable jewelry for the Marquise's daughter, which perfectly matched her eyes. And yet it was very difficult for the brides. They had to dress up too much for such an event. But everything could not go as calmly as before, because more guests arrived at the jewelry store where the bride was sitting. Before they could say a word, the girl, as if fearing the consequences, said something to the seller. At first he didn't want to agree to this, but the risk of the shop being destroyed was more terrible than this condition. Once everything was decided, she turned to the ladies who had just entered, because she should have looked at the calendar before leaving the house. After all, meeting two messengers of trouble at once was tiring. These words did not go unanswered. The girls were very angry at such an answer. Cecilia shouldn't have gotten so cocky just because she was marrying Chris. This conversation promised to be tiring, because apparently they were hurt by these words. Apparently it was because of envy. This was not at all the case, since it was not yet known which of them was more unlucky, which was why there was nothing to envy. If there was nothing to envy, then shouldn't the girls be happy for her, and not angry? Their conversation only led to a dead end, so the ladies decided to buy all the accessories that the Marquise's daughter had in her hands. Even the maid noticed that this was already too low and it was time to stop this unspoken feud. But for Cecilia this was not a problem. On the contrary, she allowed them to buy all this jewelry. There was no point in making a scandal just before the wedding, because the Duke must have had terrible taste. And today they got away with it. All their words were aimed at the girl and not the most pleasant ones. And only after these ladies left, the maid tried to find out why she allowed them to say whatever they wanted. It was all because being a woman was sometimes very uncomfortable and she couldn't just draw her sword. But there were other ways to take revenge. At that moment, the seller brought the difference in price with that necklace. Cecilia set a trap casually and even deliberately provoked them to spend more. Although it was just a small trick, the maid still needed to learn this. And now, since she received the difference from the purchase, the girl could afford a necklace with a gold coin. All further purchases were boring and monotonous. Preparations went on as usual. At the same time, in the imperial palace, everything was also going wonderfully with preparations for the wedding. Even the guy couldn't help him, because the Duke did everything himself, quickly and in the best possible way, without even having to interfere. Besides, he would soon be married, so the guy decided to get used to calling him sir right away. But now was not the time for that. It was necessary to make sure it was ready. Besides, Cecilia liked necklaces. It was worth putting more of them. And tomorrow Norton will go on a detour and pass through the busiest street. It was madness to ride a horse through the streets with so many other carriages following behind you. Moreover, they traveled such a long way just for the sake of wedding gifts that the bride might like. And there was an innumerable number of gifts, with several boxes in the back of each cart. As expected from a duke's wedding, everything had to be at the highest level, with every detail worked out. While the guy was riding on a horse, he noticed two girls in the next carriage who were constantly teasing the Marquise's daughter. He knew perfectly well about their actions, and now bullying the Duchess was comparable to going into battle against the Duke. In addition, they blocked the road with their carriage, which prevented the carts behind from passing freely. At first, the girls did not understand that the order to clear the road was addressed specifically to them. But as soon as the horses sped up and the clatter of hooves could be heard, they realized that they had been wrong to disobey. Moreover, everyone knew that they did not love Lord Chris just as much as they did his new wife, Cecilia. After all the gossip from the royal palace spread too quickly among the people. There was no time to stop, because all the preparations for the wedding had to be completed as quickly as possible. And after some time, a messenger from the Duke arrived with all the gifts for the wedding. The Marquise's daughter did not believe this, because the preparations would take a lot of time. And yet, why did they send someone? Perhaps the Duke had already changed his mind about the wedding. But it wasn't that simple. They brought wedding gifts that were worth seeing. It was surprising because only a few days had passed. It could be some kind of trap to take revenge. It was very strange that the Duke was in such a hurry, since preparations should take at least a month. The girl wouldn't let that happen, so there was nothing left to do but sort out the wedding gifts. When she reached the place where the wedding gifts were to be delivered, the lady was shocked. After all, there were a large number of boxes lying on the street, which didn't even allow one to pass peacefully, and besides, these weren't all the boxes. This is exactly what the royal wedding looked like, which was not surprising, because the Duke had been waiting for his lady for a long time. While Marquis Dusk was talking with Lord Norstein, he noticed that the lady had finally arrived. As soon as the guy saw her, he immediately greeted her as his mistress, which was unusual to hear from such a person. Besides, Lord Chris said that she loved jewelry, so there was quite a lot of it in the boxes she brought. But they didn't know that she actually preferred swords to jewelry, but it was still worth thanking. While they were discussing the wedding gifts, a messenger from the royal palace arrived to see them. There were so many events that day, so it was not worth staying in one place. And a few minutes later they met with an envoy from the royal palace. He arrived at the command of His Majesty because they had arrived to deliver more wedding gifts. There were already too many of them, and there was less and less space left. It was impossible to get through them. And the crowd that had gathered in the area envied Lady Cecilia, because before she had been called an ominous omen, but now she was very lucky. And since His Majesty and Lord Chris sent envoys here, then perhaps they said something specific. But nothing of the sort happened, although it seemed that the Duke was very serious about this marriage and they talked about it for a long time. All this talk about the upcoming marriage was unbearable, making the lady look as if her soul had left her body. And yet, it was all suspicious, because Lord Chris really did fall in love with her, otherwise he would not have gone so far. It was indeed strange, although love at first sight existed, but they were talking about the god of war. In any case, it was necessary to remain calm, even if the man was serious. It was necessary to pretend that nothing was happening. The girl did not want to hear or listen to the servant, because this was a merciless god of war who definitely had no emotions. Everyone was talking about nothing but this marriage, and only towards night everything finally calmed down. It was the perfect chance to escape this trap and finally let off all my steam. Besides, she hadn't had such a chance to rest and relax for a long time after such hard days of preparation. Moreover, no one could guarantee that the girl would be able to maintain her freedom after marriage. Therefore, it was worthwhile to have a full rest while such an opportunity was still unlimited. And as soon as Cecilia came to some bar, they had an awkward and meaningless code, lizard and garlic. After pronouncing this code to the employee, he immediately asked to follow him to an unknown direction. They walked for quite a long time along a dark corridor in which there was almost no lighting, and at the end of the corridor there was only one door, which the Marquise's daughter had been wanting to get into all this time. And behind the door itself, there was an underground arena where it was already full of people voting for different participants. And at the same time, the presenter in the center announced that, according to the latest information, the White Raven would take part in the duel, and his opponent would be a newcomer, which was quite a novelty, since the White Raven had not appeared in this place for a long time. But now the Black Sheep, namely Cecilia, was interested in who her opponent would be in the next round. This newcomer, according to the man, was very strong, so it was worth being on guard during the battle. And there was no need to worry about her, because no matter who it was, the lady would be able to win in any case. Although this sounded good, the man knew for sure that the opponent would be stronger than she thought. After all, he knew exactly who would fight against the girl, and this was not the easiest opponent. And the god of war himself, who, just like her, decided to come to this place to have a little fun. Two blades that suited each other, each with its own strength. The audience was delighted with this performance because the well-known White Raven was also on stage. The audience couldn't be kept waiting for long, so soon a White Raven and a Demon Dragon entered the arena. Everyone who watched this mostly voted for the girl, that she could win again. But her opponent, a male Demon Dragon, even with a mask, looked eerily familiar. It was a pretty banal tackle, especially in that situation. Although can a man compliment a man in order to please him? He probably knows more than just talking, since he says things like that even before the fight starts. The man didn't really want to listen to all this, because if they fought, everything would immediately fall into place. It didn't take long to persuade, and a moment later their blades crossed, beginning a duel. And as soon as this happened, the White Raven noted that the opponent's strength was quite good, which was worthy of praise. Besides this, the man had a good reaction, which was also commendable. But even though he jumped back to avoid the blow, at that very moment the Demon Dragon pounced on his opponent again. His next blow was quite strong and seemed to warn that the show had only just begun. It was impossible to withstand such a blow, which caused the White Raven to be thrown back. This performance amazed the audience and no one else supported it. Everyone shouted only for the Demon Dragon. Although they still didn't understand who he was, in his very first match he went one-on-one against a Black Sheep. But the only person who knew his identity was only glad that he only used a sword skill without explaining anything. Otherwise, because of this duel, the entire building would have to be rebuilt because their strength was like heaven and earth. But the match was still going on, and the White Raven was not going to give in to his opponent, continuing the battle. Everything was going from bad to worse. It was clear that the Demon Dragon was much stronger than him. And after just a few seconds, the White Raven was pinned down, with nowhere left to retreat or run. Because of this trick, he almost fell, but suddenly the man quickly grabbed his opponent, preventing him from falling. But now the pink-haired one didn't care at all. His technique and strength were at the highest level, but nothing was heard about him. This behavior did not go unnoticed, and some began to rebel in honor of it. But the words about the White Raven being weak were immediately cut off by him, calming the hall. And yet the public couldn't help but discuss the Demon Dragon. He seemed cold, but was actually kind, which only fueled interest. While everyone was talking about the man, the pink-haired man did not understand why he helped his enemy. It was all simple, because if she got hurt, it could interfere with the wedding. The disguise was completely revealed. Although the girl did not immediately realize that it was Christopher, a few moments later the whole situation dawned on her. But this situation will remain only between them, so the ladies need to be much quieter so as not to reveal their disguise. By this time, the host had arrived and announced the results of the match, where the victory went to the Demon Dragon. After this moment, they went their separate ways to do their own thing. There was no point in staying any longer. Chris had already arrived home, where Norton was surprised that a regular match had turned into a real fight. He apparently needed this victory so badly, but the man only wanted the lady not to get hurt fighting with someone else. It was surprising to hear that His Majesty was so worried about his bride. Moreover, they fought with each other at every meeting from the very beginning, so what will happen on their wedding night? Apparently Norstein had so little to do that he started to rave, even though he should be at the outpost right now. These words quickly brought the guy to his senses, which is why he immediately ran off to continue preparing for the wedding. With these words, he left the room, leaving Christopher completely alone. It was a relief, because now no one would ask inappropriate questions. Now they could think about everything that had happened during the night. They should have been more careful. At the same time, the girl had already arrived home, where she also had to think about everything that had happened. After the fight, she realized that the man was apparently not in love with her at all. Although the maid tried to convince Cecilia otherwise, in the morning Chris said something completely different. But that was only in the morning, because he was watching her and even went out to fight in the arena, and in the end, the lady lost. They fought every time they found themselves together. What would happen on their wedding day? The girl didn't want to think about it at all, but it would be bad if everyone found out that she had been to underground fights. But there was no need to worry because they still had 3 days, which was enough to cancel everything. A whole hour had passed since this conversation with the maid, but my thoughts could not allow me to fall asleep during this entire time. No matter how much Cecilia tossed and turned, she kept thinking about how to make Christopher regret what had happened. Fortunately, sleep had already taken hold of her body within a few minutes, and the lady slept until the morning. And only because of some incomprehensible sound, she had to get up in order to check the place from where it came. Stepping out onto the balcony, she immediately noticed a strange box with an elegant sword inside. Apparently, this gift was an apology for what happened last night. This gesture was unexpectedly sweet on his part, and the next 3 days passed in the same spirit. And finally, the wedding day arrived, for which the girl had been preparing since early morning. She should have already given in and accepted that the wedding would happen, since it had not been cancelled by the man during all these days. While the lady was getting ready, a woman entered the room and brought the dress ordered by Her Majesty the Empress. Although Cecilia did not understand what all this fuss was about and why they had disturbed the Empress. It was all simple, because the lady's mother and Her Majesty the Empress wanted this wedding to be wonderful. It was unbearable to hear that she was being married off so easily to such a man that tears just started coming from her eyes. A lot of time passed from that moment, and the moment came when Christopher came for her. The man stood at the gate, offering his hand to his bride, inviting her to go further. It was a good moment to thank him for the gift of the sword as they walked. And just a few minutes later, they were sitting in the carriage, discussing how, of all the gifts he had given her, she had only liked one. But even though they had only been driving for a few minutes, the man felt hot, even though the lady had not used any force. It was terrible. Chris's condition was deteriorating too quickly, so they needed to hide this fact from everyone as quickly as possible. Before they entered the city, the man quickly covered himself with the veil that Cecilia was wearing. Fortunately for everyone, those around were only touched by this passion. Everyone thought that this marriage was full of love. But even the girl's maid thought that the Duke was rushing things too quickly, and only Norton understood that the worst-case scenario was happening. There were no other options to get settled as quickly as possible, otherwise everything could only get worse. At the same time, the girl was all red from embarrassment, because such things can only be done after the ceremony. But before he could receive an answer, the horses that were driving the carriage suddenly sped up. Cecilia was not prepared for this, which is why she involuntarily began to fall. Luckily, a man managed to catch her. He couldn't wait any longer, which is why they needed to get home faster. At this moment, they were so close to each other that one could feel the partner's breath. This only embarrassed the lady even more, because the man had completely forgotten about the clauses in their contract. No physical contact without the partner's consent, and now that was a violation of the agreement. If she does this in public, her reputation will be ruined, even though she never had one. But this did not mean that one could do whatever came to mind. Apparently, the girl completely forgot that, just like her, the man also had his own conditions. There was only one, quite simple one, namely to skillfully hide. This whole picture was still visible to all those who came to watch the ceremony. All the nobles who came were shocked by such closeness during such an event, and now the maid Cecilia would have to somehow explain everything to Madame, which was another headache. Luckily, they arrived at Duke Christopher's estate fairly quickly. They were brought to the backyard away from everyone. The view there was incredible, and as soon as the carriage stopped, it was finally possible to get out. But at that moment, Norstein approached them, apparently worried about Christopher's condition. Although now was not the time for this, it was necessary to urgently take the Duke to the room. That was the first priority, but what about Cecilia? What would she do? After all, they couldn't both disappear from the ceremony that could have raised a ton of questions from everyone. At least one of them had to be present, but as soon as the lady tried to leave, she was grabbed by the arm. Christopher didn't want to let the girl go. She couldn't leave him so easily, forcing her to go with him. There was nothing left to do but go with him without asking unnecessary questions. This behavior of the lady was incomprehensible to North, as if he was trying to push her so that she would find out about something. But as soon as Cecilia decided to find out what he was hinting at, the guy changed the subject of the conversation. He still had to report to His Majesty what had happened, so now the lady would have to take care of my lord. With these words he left, and only the maid remained, who was worried, because if they could not make a public appearance, everything would be terrible. But now was not the time to worry about that. Now she had to lead Chris into the room. At this time, luxurious tables were already set, all the dishes sparkled with cleanliness and richness, and in the hall of the ducal mansion, many nobles gathered, waiting for the event to begin. Many were already discussing that their majesties had already arrived, but the main characters were still missing. But some heard that the Duke was going to start it right in the carriage, on the way to the ceremony, in front of everyone. And simply unable to bear it any longer, as soon as they got here, they immediately went to the privacy room. It was terrible because how could such shamelessness be allowed in front of everyone? And apparently the Duke's servants were trying to buy time. They were becoming more and more interesting with each passing minute. Everyone saw how Norstein was passing something on to His Majesty. Now he will solve this problem. He made up a story that Cecilia had been injured due to problems with the carriage, so Chris was now accompanying her. There was no point in wasting time, so His Majesty announced the beginning of the ceremony. Everything will go according to plan, although some were worried about Cecilia, but everything was fine. There was no need to worry. His Majesty personally resolved the situation, thinking that the ladies would let it go so easily. At the same time, the girl finally brought Christopher to his room. The man was much heavier than he appeared, causing sweat to stream down the lady's face. Luckily, she had the help of a maid, whom he could call at any time if he needed anything. But her mere presence seemed to irritate the man, and he ordered her to get out and not disturb them. He had the look of a hungry animal, and now he didn't look like himself at all. Such a sudden change in mood was frightening, as if domestic violence was about to occur. But there was nothing left to do but leave the room, as the maid was ordered. At the same time, Cecilia finally carried the Duke to the bed so that he could rest. Now the girl could go to the ceremony, where guests had already been waiting for them for a long time. But this was not Christopher's plan. He grabbed the lady's hand, pulling her towards him. Now they were very close to each other again, and he was again doing whatever came to his mind. While she was trying to understand what was happening, Chris was already hanging over her, having managed to unbutton his shirt. He wanted to hear again all the conditions the girl had voiced. Just like when she threatened him, he wanted her to empty him. All his actions and words were inappropriate. Cecilia no longer understood anything. And yet she tried to warn again that she would not allow her conditions to be ignored. Only then did Christopher realize that she had imagined something, although it was he who had started saying strange things. But although it sounded strange, the man spoke seriously, so that the lady would empty him completely. The thing was, his mana was about to get out of control, so now she had to use her absorption ability and calm it down. I should have said so right away, because the situation that happened now had a completely different meaning. Chris didn't want to figure out what she had managed to come up with in her head, but now they had to at least try. After all, life depended on it, and if the mana was not calmed down soon, the outcome would not be the best. But although Cecilia had this ability, she never used it and did not understand at all how to help. Anything could have happened, all sorts of thoughts came into my head, even not the best ones. Luckily, the Duke had heard that the girl could absorb an object's mana by touching it. A decision was made to start with the hands, but it seemed that one touch was not enough. An important part of draining mana was concentrating to absorb it, which is why nothing worked in the carriage. Fortunately, this helped and the absorption continued for several minutes, but it was too slow. It was worth trying to hold them with both hands for more effective absorption, otherwise they would sit like that for several days. Touching both hands at once helped the process go much faster. Marrying her was the best decision. They sat like that for some time, but how long could the lady continue like that? Since she hadn't been able to sleep properly the previous night, she was getting sleepy. This was a hint to finish quickly, because it was still unknown how long she could hold out like this. Luckily, Cecilia no longer had to attend the ceremony and was able to take a short nap. She could certainly do that, but Christopher still had the question of whether she had ever studied magic. The girl's magic was not like everyone else's, so when she was born, everyone thought she didn't have any at all. Therefore, the lady decided that there was no particular point in studying it, and even now she did not really understand her ability. The Duke assumed that the larger the area of contact between important parts of the body, the faster the absorption of magic. Although it may seem a little exciting, these words completely threw the girl off balance. Cecilia again stopped understanding him, especially when he was too close. But magic was generated not only in the heart, but also in the brain, so in addition to the heart, they needed to touch their foreheads. It was worth trying, and as soon as they touched foreheads, the mana absorption really did go much faster. Although it was a little uncomfortable to absorb it like this, because the lady felt his pulse, which was too fast. From that moment on, 3 whole hours passed. That's how long it took for it to be completely absorbed. And only when it was all over and there were no more changes could you open your eyes. All this time they were very close to each other, and as Chris said, it was really exciting. She said this still not realizing what was happening, but as soon as she realized, the girl's whole face turned red. Out of fear, Cecilia pushed the man away because they were already finished and there was no longer any need to hold on to each other. To this, the Duke merely apologized, since for the first time in a long time he felt so well. The lady could not hear such perverted words after that because she was already too embarrassed. But besides that, she felt like she had run a big marathon and was very hungry. After that, I really needed to eat, but it wasn't the best idea to leave the room right now. But the girl didn't care, because even if she was known as a woman with a bad reputation, she couldn't hide forever. Cecilia was about to leave when Christopher suddenly took out a mirror, trying to explain his words. And only after looking at herself in the reflection did she immediately realize that something had happened to her hair during this time. Apparently, the reason was that the darker the color of the girl's hair, the stronger the magic she absorbed. Perhaps her hair will return to normal once she has completely absorbed the Duke's mana, but for now she will have to hide her hair. Besides this, the girl could not go out for the reason that it was necessary to hide the fact that Chris's mana was out of control. Now she felt like just a tool that had been used and thrown away. The man didn't like these words at all, reminding him once again of the conditions that he had violated. It seems she didn't say anything, but if she had known that she would simply be used, she would never have agreed to marry him. She probably shouldn't have said such rude words, but it was too late to change anything. Now it was time to tell Chris that nowhere could one find such a woman with such calloused hands. It was true, but there was nothing that could be done about her hands. But if the lady becomes his wife, he will not ask for anything except the absorption of mana. She could practice with a sword every day and even take part in underground fights. Christopher will help hide her status and may even take the girl to the military camp as his wife. And all because the moment he first saw her, he immediately realized that she was different from other women. But the most important thing is that the girl will be able to remain herself and not adapt to high society. His words were good, but he could not even hope that for this reason alone she would thank him. Although he didn't expect any words of gratitude, it was enough for him that they both benefited from this relationship. With these words, the man wanted to leave the room when he suddenly stopped. Finally, Christopher apologized because he had never thought that his hair would change color. Apparently, he didn't know about the hair either, which proved the fact that her abilities were unique. But right now, she needed to get a good rest because she had spent a lot of energy while absorbing mana. And if anything happens, if you need anything, Chris will be in the next room. This attitude towards the lady was unexpectedly sweet on his part, although before this he had behaved like a rude man. Much time passed from that moment and night came. The Duke looked much better than usual. Norton was right, because now he felt so good only thanks to Cecilia's ability. This girl's ability was incredibly useful to him, there was no doubt about it. After all, until now he had been struggling to cope and had barely managed to slightly suppress his magic during the day. And this time it took only 3 hours for a full recovery, which was incredible. And yet, because of this, the man missed almost the entire day and was not even aware of the situation outside. Fortunately, Norstein continued to observe after his return, and several people from the unknown group left, apparently to report. Besides this, there was something else that was much more serious than the previous news. It turned out that an unpleasant rumor had arisen, and since Milady's mother and Her Highness the Empress were here, they needed to explain themselves. The fact that rumors were spreading was not very good, and it really was worth sorting it out. The rumor itself was that the man and Lady Cecilia had behaved too passionately in the carriage that they had not even shown up for the celebration, and since they were talking about the ceremony, they were missing several people from their entourage who were supposed to be present. This really had to be the case, so in order not to continue this conversation, the guy took his leave, because he needed to keep an eye on that group. With these words, Norton left Christopher's office without explaining himself. The report on what happened was not the best, and he decided to decide everything tomorrow. There were many matters to be resolved throughout the night, and the next day, the problems that had arisen were being resolved at Duke Christopher's estate. At the same time, Cecilia was about to go out, but because of her darkened hair, they had to close it. The maid wasn't sure it was a good idea to go out looking like that, but she had no choice, because the girl couldn't just up and not go. Moreover, a whole day passed, and the hair color still hadn't changed, which only made the situation worse. Although a full 24 hours have not yet passed, and perhaps everything will change soon. While the lady was getting ready to leave, 2 women were sitting below, and Christopher approached them. They were both worried about Cecilia's condition, and before they could answer, the lady came down the stairs, shouting something to Chris. The man tried to show her with his hand that she should not come down, because he was not alone at all. But the girl did not pay attention to the warnings and continued down the stairs. She continued to scold the Duke, saying that he always thought only of himself. And as soon as the lady had almost descended, she could finally see that all this time her mother and Her Majesty the Empress had been sitting below. The fact that Christopher had not warned her earlier angered the girl, because she did not want to see anyone at all. But then the maid reported that the whole time she was going down, he had been making hand signals. This confused the girl even more, because she really didn't notice the hints not to go down. But it was too late. Cecilia's mother heard all the ladies swearing, even though she taught her manners. I had to think of something urgently, and the only thing that came to mind was to greet the women who had been sitting there all this time. Titania should have stopped being so strict with the lady, because they also behaved in a similar way at that age. Although Her Majesty the Empress spoiled the girl too much. While the women were laughing, one of them noticed that the lady was wearing a shawl on her head in the room. Only then did she realize that she should have thought of what to say in this situation earlier. Luckily, Christopher came to the rescue and said that she just caught a cold yesterday, and the doctor advised her to keep her head warm. It was necessary to play along, that this was exactly how it was, even though it could cause a lot of trouble. While the man was talking to the woman, Cecilia didn't understand why everyone had a strange manner of speech today. A man's words that he will be careful with a girl and will not allow her to cause unnecessary problems. Her Majesty the Empress counted on the Duke to do everything as it should be. And since the girl had already come, it was impossible to just leave without saying anything. Because of this, I had to stay with the women and continue the conversation I had started. In fact, the lady should have come yesterday, but she couldn't. But that wasn't the point. Now the woman was wondering if Chris needed to be forced to take responsibility. At first, Cecilia didn't really understand what was being said, turning her head towards the Duke as if looking for an answer. The man looked at him as if to indicate that he should agree so that he would take responsibility. There was nothing left to do but tell Chris to do what he had to do. It took less than a few seconds for the man to pull out a dagger with a luxurious engraving from under his cloak. The girl did not expect at all that this is exactly what responsibility looks like. After all, right before her eyes, Christopher inflicted a fairly deep wound on his stomach, leaving red stains on his clothes. The blame for yesterday's incident lay with him, so it was natural that he took responsibility for it. Because Chris's old wound had reopened, they were unable to attend the ceremony to take care of it. Even if it was his fault, the man shouldn't have to inflict new wounds on himself just because of that. He didn't agree with this at all, because if you do something, you need to do it well, so that there are no mistakes. Moreover, they had already bandaged him and stopped the bleeding, so everything was fine. At this point, their meeting ended, as it was already late, so the Empress asked to be escorted. Chris couldn't refuse the woman, and moments later he was walking straight after them. But Cecilia still didn't understand why it was necessary to put on such a performance. It all happened because the Duke himself proposed this idea to Her Majesty the Empress and the Marquise, and all this just to stop the not very pleasant rumor that happened yesterday due to their arbitrariness. Fortunately, public opinion will be expertly controlled, so her reputation will be fine. But it wasn't even about the girl's reputation, even though she was furious about what happened. Before she had time to explain herself to Norstein, a man entered the room with an invitation for her. Handing over a neat envelope with a green seal, he explained that the Redites would soon have a celebration. Although they had had a rather bad relationship for a long time, why then did they send her this invitation? They didn't just have a bad relationship, they were more like a cat and dog. Did the lady completely forget about the incident in the jewelry store, which was not the case at all? But in her current situation, if Cecilia thought about not coming, everyone would think she was scared. Therefore, there was nothing left to do but come to them in 3 days, no matter what the cost. Luckily, the person delivering the invitation was supposed to be nearby, so Norton agreed to pass on the message. The guy was acting like he was all important. Emily should have watched her manners. After all, he was the Duke's assistant, although it was he who told them to go to the backyard. If he hadn't told them to do that, they wouldn't be in such trouble now. Everything was exactly like that, but now they have to keep everything a secret, so it would be better for the maid to continue to think so. It was even a pity that Norstein was so unfairly accused without knowing the whole truth. And when the guy returned, he couldn't help but notice that the girl's gaze was full of sympathy. By this time, Christopher had returned not empty-handed, but with many letters. Most of them were about the upcoming meeting in 3 days, although this was the most obvious trap. But everything had already been decided. If Cecilia said that she was going, then so it would be. Even if they had something in mind, then let them just try. And now it was time for her to rest, because Chris, so insightful and decisive, ready to take responsibility for his actions, had decided everything. He was the undisputed leader, but the girl was not a subordinate rat, so she did not even think of surrendering to him so easily. After all, the fault was still the man's, so there was no need to thank him. But he reminded that it was just a deal, so he didn't need any gratitude. With these words, he took North with him, going deep into the building with him. As soon as they left, Cecilia asked if there was any rumor that Chris was emotionless, that he didn't care about the feelings of others. Emily hadn't heard anything like that, only that he became a marshal at a very young age and mercilessly destroyed all enemies. Only then did the girl finally remember his terrible reputation. Apparently, this happened because they spent these days in close proximity. But in any case, the lady did not marry him out of love, but the anger that remained had to be vented somewhere. The only option was to go underground, and Emily would have to help cover it up. And although Cecilia was now a married woman, everything was fine, even if the Duke found out about it. After all, it was he who said that the girl could do whatever she wanted, and nothing would happen to her. At this time, Christopher returned to his office, where Norton was already lecturing him that he should watch what he said. After all, he was now a married man, but all that Chris was concerned about now was the report. This was also important because, as it turned out, one of the mysterious forces had appeared in the underground battles. There were a lot of different people there, and the place was complicated, so it would be difficult to find them. Although this was not such a problem at all, because there was one person who knew about this place better than anyone else. And it was at that moment that Cecilia jumped over the wall in broad daylight, heading specifically for the underground fights. It was necessary to follow her, which is what the Duke himself decided to do, while the guy would report everything briefly. Even Norton realized that the girl would be out of luck if the man managed to catch her red-handed. The girl walked through the streets for a long time heading to the underground fights, but after some time she finally arrived. She was immediately met by a man who was clearly surprised by such an unexpected arrival of a white raven. But Cecilia was not in the best mood, so she was insolent with every word. He had long been accustomed to this attitude when talking to her, because the lady only came to this place when she was in a bad mood. But he still didn't want to be near her, even though he had no magic at all, and there was nothing to be afraid of. And in order not to continue this conversation, the man said that Reikaku's fight was supposed to take place today. This was better news, because in that case it would be worth preparing a VIP box to watch the fight. After all, the girl was a true fan of Reikaku and could not miss such a rare sight. But unfortunately for Cecilia, all the tickets were already sold, but there were those who had not yet arrived. The only thing you could do was try your luck and sit in some unoccupied seat. After all, the girl could not miss this fight, and those who showed up at the wrong time were ignorant. But fortunately, there were those who acted so foolishly and missed such a great performance. At the same time, while she sat and waited, someone behind her began to discuss the ceremony of Duke Chris and his wife. Although most believed that they missed such an event because of the man's open wound, not everyone was willing to believe this, spreading rumors that it was all a lie, as there were several reliable informants. More and more people began to join in this conversation, spreading not the best rumors, continuing to say that the newlyweds were so excited that they could not appear in public. The girls' patience was running out because they said whatever came into their heads. And they didn't even think about stopping, continuing to make up the story that Cecilia had injured her back because of this. Now she will no longer be able to be willful, as before their conversation has long since crossed all boundaries of decency. It didn't matter where she was anymore, but she couldn't just let go of spreading such rumors, which left no choice but to splash an entire bottle of water on them. Of course, no one was happy with this behavior, but they smelled so bad that the lady decided to wash them. And as soon as the guy behind wanted to show something, the lady immediately took up her sword. Those who were nearby immediately realized that this man was a white raven. The guy should have stopped right there, which he didn't want to do, because according to the arena rules, participants can't even touch the spectators. This was exactly how it was, and she could not harm them in any way, nor teach them a lesson for such words. But now she was an ordinary passerby, warning that if you think about all sorts of nonsense, then your thinking will only be like that. Before she could say anything further, Cecilia noticed out of the corner of her eye a familiar figure approaching her. It was Christopher, who arrived just in time because she couldn't use force. The girl wanted him to do it, but the man only advised her to remember their faces for the future. These words immediately put the gossips in their place, so there was no point in dwelling on them any longer, because the battle would soon begin. And yet, the lady did not understand at all why it was necessary to remember their faces. Didn't Chris care about his reputation? But for him, it was not important at all, because now there was a more important matter, and it was impossible to attract unnecessary attention. This attitude towards such a situation was strange, because why was such secrecy necessary? And only after they sat down, the lady realized that the place next to her was indeed his, which meant that the Duke had also come to the Reikaku fight, which was not the case at all, because if there were no suspicious people among the spectators, they were among the athletes. As soon as he finished speaking, the host announced a grand fight with the star of the Reikaku arena. The girl couldn't sit still, because she was a big fan of the fighter and knew almost everything about him, dreaming of fighting him every day, which is unlikely to happen. At the same time, Christopher was thinking about his own things, trying to figure out which of the fighters was strange. Today the man seemed out of place, asking Cecilia for help with his task. But without even listening, she immediately refused it, because she was still disappointed with what had happened earlier. Although this request was serious, because the lady knew the local fighters better than Christopher. And it will only be easier for her to find the right one, someone inconspicuous, with whom it will be easy to deal. All his words spoke of one thing: he was apparently one of those perverts who bought fighters for his own amusement. These words of Cecilia were heard by almost everyone who was sitting next to them, and they began to spread rumors about what had happened. But that was not at all what he wanted to say when he apologized to everyone, saying the first thing that came to mind. And because Christopher held the lady close to him, he was ruining his disguise as a man. But now was not the time for that, because what she thought was not at all true. There was a reason for that. After all, the Duke had important business in this place, which could not be told in such a crowded place. As soon as they finished talking, the Reikaku fight, which many spectators were waiting for, finally began. And only Cecilia looked as if she, of all people, was the only one who was waiting for this fight. Finally, the star himself, wearing a dark brown cloak whom many had been waiting for, entered the arena. And his opponent was a silver rat who was glad to fight such a legend of the arena. One of these two was the one Christopher was looking for. All that remained was to find out who exactly. And while the fight had not yet begun, the host asked everyone to take their places, because the fight was beginning. And as soon as these words were spoken, the two opponents crossed their swords. It was too difficult to figure out which of them was too weird and pretending to be the wrong one. While everyone watched the fight, it was over in the blink of an eye, Reikaku wounding his opponent with quick movements. The wound was so serious that the blood flowed continuously, quickly flowing onto the arm. It was strange, because the silver rat was not so weak that he could be pinned down like that. And now he couldn't dodge the enemy's blade at all. Perhaps Chris came for this reason. Besides this, the girl heard that today's match would only be between these two. Their skill levels should have been at least roughly the same, but Reikaku overwhelmingly dominated the fight. Apparently, Cecilia did notice something during this short duel. This was exactly the case, because no matter how strong you were, it was still impossible to become stronger in a short period of time. So it was a completely different person, and finally the one was found. It would be very noisy, so the lady had to stay away, which she did not want at all. After all, she knew this place much better than the Duke, which is why she would be very useful. There was nothing left to do but take the girl with him, on the condition that she would not move a single step away from the man. After all, ever since he returned from the battlefield, Chris has been constantly watched by some mysterious group. And now they had reliable intelligence that one of the participants had infiltrated the underground fights. And the informant himself could be nearby. This was the reason why he wanted the lady to show the fighters. Apparently, someone was posing as Reikaku to achieve their own selfish goals. In that case, they had very little time, because if Reikaku was injured, it would be terrible. This attitude towards some man worried Christopher, because she was already too worried about him. If it had been anyone else, it would have been, but posing as a fighting star was unacceptable. While the girl was rushing through the corridors in search of Reikaku, one of the fighters approached them. It was that same pseudo-Reikaku who returned completely alone without the silver rat. It was all because he was wounded, so he went to treat his wounds, but these wounds were serious. The girl was his fan, but she was so worried about his opponent that it was strange. But the strangest thing was that Reikaku never spoke to the other fighters. He was definitely a fake. And as soon as this was discovered, a sharp sword was placed against the man's neck, as if in warning. Unfortunately, the fake's reflexes were too good, allowing him to dodge the blow. It was even more rude to suddenly attack with a sword. The Duke had no manners at all. But in front of someone like him, there was no need to observe propriety. While the man held the fake, he tried to hint with his hand that the search was still ongoing. Luckily, the pseudo-Reikaku was not averse to fighting the Empire's marshal, the god of war Chris. After all, his skills were truly impressive, which made me want to continue fighting with such a strong opponent. At the same time, Cecilia managed to leave unnoticed, although she did not understand why he spoke as if he was closely acquainted with Christopher. And as soon as the lady approached the nearest door, opening it, behind her was a tied-up man and the real Reikaku.